Hello again. I am something of a connoisseur of hypocrisy, both my own and that of others. Luckily, I have a wife who is always ready and willing to puncture my own pomposity and draw attention to my hypocrisy, but others are not so fortunate. I watched Azeem Rafiq make quite a meal of the racism of which he was apparently a victim, and observed with interest the tears in his eyes. After making such a public exhibition of himself, it was perhaps inevitable that he would come a cropper, and sure enough, this has happened. An exchange of messages has come to light on the internet. I came across this in the paper today. He's apologised for his anti-Semitic messages. He says of another Muslim in these messages who had seemingly been reluctant to pay his share for a meal, he is a Jew. Only Jews do that shit. Seriously, I used to hear that kind of racism when I was a child, but I honestly thought it had died out now. Describing somebody as Jewish because one thought that the person was tight-fisted. I rather thought that this language had been consigned to history like the casual use of other racial epithets. It seems not. That it should be a Muslim who is displaying racial prejudice of this kind is awful. I do hope that this frightful show-off will now stop talking about racism and perhaps examine his own heart. Shocking hypocrisy. I came across this in today's paper, as I say. I give a link about the story in the description to this video. I couldn't help noticing, though, that there are a few other fascinating news items in today's newspaper. For example, the town of Rotherham is mentioned here under the headline here, former Labour peer on trial over historical child abuse. The peer concern is the rather unfortunately named Lord Ahmed of Rotherham. Since the case is now sub judice, I shall say no more about it, other than to quote Tom Little QC, who is the prosecuting barrister. He said, "This is about repeated sexual abuse that took place in Rotherham over a number of years. I say no more on this subject and turned instead to what seems to be a fairly regular event these days, which is a Caribbean suffering from paranoid schizophrenia who has gone on a rampage with a carving knife. Zephaniah MacLeod killed one man in Birmingham and wounded 7 others. I am bound to say that this kind of incident was once unknown but now crops up regularly in the news." Looking at the wider world, I observe that Kamala Harris, the American Vice President, now has an approval rating of just 28%. This is perhaps inevitably attributed to racism and sexism. There does not seem to be any awareness that women can be just as useless in politics as men, and that having a dark skin is no substitute for the ability to do a job. After all, Joe Biden is on an approval rating of just 38%, and I doubt that racism or sexism plays any part in the lack of enthusiasm shown by the American public for their leader. Talking of Biden, I cannot understand why the media seem to be determined to protect him. I suppose that the American news channels are embarrassed about the obvious fact that his mental powers are declining and that he can barely remain awake, let alone deliver a coherent and rational speech. That's no reason for the BBC to avoid mentioning the fact that there is a president who can barely string a sentence together. After all, they were quick enough off the mark to savage Trump when he was president. But no, they don't show any of it on the news. Increasingly, I'm turning to the Australian news broadcasters who do not tiptoe around the subject. Everybody seems determined to gloss over it in Britain and the United States. Last week, for example, Biden, in a filmed speech available on YouTube, described the baseball player Satchel Paige as a great Negro. Now, of course, Negro isn't an offensive expression. I mean, remember the film about James Baldwin recently, I Am Not Your Negro. But I would certainly not use the word myself. It was at one time the polite way of referring to black people, but these days I don't think that many black people would care to be described in those terms. Imagine if Trump had talked to somebody as being a great Negro. I rather think that both the BBC and other progressive types would have leapt on it as evidence of either racism or being hopelessly out of touch with the modern world. I give a link to a news item on this, and as I say, YouTube has a film of the speech with the president, as usual these days, stumbling over his words and appearing a bit confused. Perhaps Kamala Harris's low approval ratings are connected with the fact that nobody really expects Biden to last in the post for another 3 years, and it's dawning on many that they face the prospect of having this useless woman as President of the United States soon.